So, welcome to this month's Schuman Talk. This is when we discuss issues we face in Europe today in the light of Robert Schuman's vision for a community of peoples deeply rooted in Christian values. It was on May the 9th, 1950, at 6 p.m., when the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman gave a 3-minute speech in which he laid the foundation for the European house, where today 450 million Europeans live together in peace. Now, I see this as being the defining moment of post-war Europe because it launched the European movement for peace and unity that's led to today's European Union. The day before, there was no plan on the table. On the 9th of May, the plan was laid on the table. And this is why we send out these Schuman Talks on the 9th day of the month at 6 p.m. to make people aware of this significant event. Schuman's personal faith prompted him to enter the public square to promote peace, reconciliation, and justice. It shaped his lifestyle and his politics. He didn't use religious jargon in his politics, but his political compass was his deep faith in God, his understanding of humans as created in God's image, possessing inherent dignity and value. And while he believed in the separation of the spheres of church and state, he understood that politics was shaped by beliefs. The gospel, he believed, was a very public story and was relevant for all spheres of public discourse. And so today, our guest is someone who also believes that the gospel is a very public story and that we need to learn to tell that story in a better way. I'm talking about the Right Reverend Dr. Graham Tomlin, who was the former Bishop of Kensington. He also was one of the co-founders of the St Mellitus College. I believe that's the largest Anglican theological seminary right now. And more recently, however, has set up the Center for Cultural Witness. So I want to welcome Dr. Tomlin with us now. Graham, thank you very much indeed for being part of our conversation today. Welcome to the Schuman Talks.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Great to be with you today and looking forward to our conversation, yeah.
And it was my privilege to share a seminar with you a few months ago in Switzerland, in Fribourg University there, where we talked about education together. So I've been very much looking forward to our chat today. Now, Graham, you were Bishop of Kensington, and so you were very actively involved in the diocese. Then you saw the need to set up a new theological college associated with Holy Trinity Brompton. Now, it would seem to a lot of people, well, you had your hands full, you were busy enough. Why did you want to start a Center for Cultural Witness? Tell us about the need for that and describe what is this center all about?
Well, I've always been interested in the question of how the church communicates its message in public. And as you were saying earlier on in your introduction, that Christian faith is not just a private option that is about personal spirituality. It's something that has the capacity to shape cultures and whole societies, and it has done in Europe for the last couple of thousand years. And yet, I guess in recent times, it seems that a lot of that, the kind of Christian capital that our culture has been built on has sort of been evaporating away. And I guess I was conscious very much of both as a bishop, you have a bit of a public role. People listen to what you say, and I often found myself thinking, well, how do I speak in a way that communicates Christian faith in the opportunities I get? If I've got my 2 minutes on Radio 4, today's program in the morning, speaking to the whole nation, how do I speak as a Christian leader in those contexts? I think I was also conscious that our churches, and I oversaw about 100 churches in West London, many of them were really, really good churches doing a great job, but very often trying to sort of share the Christian gospel and communicate that. But it was like it was falling on stony ground a lot of the time. Often used to think about that parable of the sower, where the sower goes out and sows the seed. But if the seed is landing on stony ground or thin ground, it doesn't really take root and it's really hard. Now, there are other parts of the world where you share the Christian gospel and the fruit is pretty instant, in China, in South America, in Asia, whereas in Europe at the moment, and maybe in North America as well, it is pretty stony ground. And so I guess the conviction grew in my mind that we need not just to do more sowing of the seed, we actually need to prepare the ground and to till the soil of the culture, as it were, to make it more receptive to the Christian faith. And one of the periods that inspired us in that was thinking back to the 1940s, sort of time you're thinking about, when during the Second World War, there was this great debate that went on in Western Europe about what's going to rebuild civilization after the cataclysm of the Second World War and the evil of Nazism. And a group of Christians were right at the heart of that debate. People like C.S. Lewis and his broadcast talks on the radio, people like W.H. Auden, who wrote sort of long verse poems after his conversion in 1942. You have people like Dorothy Sayers writing her plays on the radio, all of them depicting a kind of rich, imaginative Christian vision of the world. And I think what they were doing is that they were kind of warming up the culture. They were tilling the soil, as it were. So that would actually, what happens when Billy Graham came along in the early 1950s, preaching a pretty simple gospel that wasn't not a lot of content to it. It was simply an invitation to come to Christ. He was preaching into a culture that, if you like, had been prepared to hear this, to receive the soil of the gospel. And so I see it seems to be that increasingly is what we need to do.
When you say about Billy Graham, just to describe to a current audience what he did in England, because my son, it was about 15, when he said, "Dad, who was Billy Graham?" That was a shocking question for me. So, well,
Billy Graham was probably one of the greatest evangelists of the 20th century, and in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, he growing out of the American context, but spreading across to Europe and elsewhere around the world, these extraordinary large crusades where many people kind of responded to Christ and became, and there's a whole generation that were kind of brought into Christian faith through his ministry. But I think it didn't just happen in a context, out of a context. It happened in the context of a culture that had become, where people kind of were warm to Christian faith. They kind of believed, they also wanted it to be true. And so that sort of preparing the soil of the culture seems to be crucial if we're going to kind of restore a sense of that sense of Christian faith as being something that actually has the capacity to shape our culture again.
Yeah. Now you talk about looking at your website, Seen and Unseen. You talk about reimagining apologetics. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think in the past years, apologetics, when you think of the word apologetics, if you're outside the church, you tend to think it means, well, people are just apologizing for being Christian. If you're inside the church, you think it kind of means lots of arguments with atheists. And it's rather been kind of determined by the rise of the new atheism. Apologetics is all about thinking up arguments why God exists and why the resurrection happened and all that kind of thing. And I'm not sure they get terribly far. And I suppose what I think we need more is kind of slightly more what Lewis and his friends were doing back in the 1940s, which was redescribing the whole of reality from a Christian perspective. What does the world look like? If this is a world that is both created by God, into which God has become incarnate in Jesus Christ, if this is a world in which evil and sin have been overcome in the resurrection, what does the world look like? It's kind of bathed in a different light. And so apologetics is more a descriptive rather than a kind of analytical exercise. It's more describing everything. So what is politics? What is housing? What does relationships? What does architecture? What does artificial intelligence? What does it all look like when you see it through the lens of Christian faith? And how does Christian faith help you understand the world better?
Yeah, so it's not just trying to convince people that there's a God and they should therefore submit to him, but it's explaining, well, what's the purpose of life, and how do we live life better, and how do we live a flourishing life? How do we solve the current issues facing us in our world today?
And how does Christian faith help you see those issues that we all face in a completely different light? How does it help you live your life better? How does it help you live a kind of flourishing life, but one that is more constructive, one that is more rooted in reality, one that is more, that is actually going to build a functioning, good, healthy, functioning society at the same time. It's a bit like that. I mean, there's a quote by C.S. Lewis, which is quite well known, that he says, I believe in God in a bit like I believe in the sun, not because I see it, but because by it I see everything else.
Yeah.
It seems to me that's kind of what we need. We see everything else differently in the light of Christian faith, and that's what Christian faith has the capacity to do.
So basically, the Center for Cultural Witness is to equip us to tell the story better. or tell a better story, actually. And both, we need to tell our story better, but we've got a better story to tell.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's both telling that story to those who are open to listening to it, and helping those who have a faith already to tell that story well. So, for example, in the website, you mentioned seenandunseen.com, and the idea of it comes from that line in the creed, that God is the maker of all things seen and unseen. And on that website, one of the key things is that everything is written for the person outside the church. It's not just a kind of internal Christian discussion. It's more, we try to get our writers to write for people who don't yet have a Christian faith, and yet to show how Christian faith makes a big difference. And so you can see there on the screen there at the moment, articles about Israel, Gaza. How does Christian faith help you understand that conflict much better? There's some reviews of films that are there that are kind of that people are watching at the moment. There's an interview with Tom Wright about politics and how our kind of understanding of politics is changed by understanding of the Christian faith. And so it tries to look at all the kind of things that everyone's talking about, but looking at it through the lens of Christian faith and how Christian faith makes a difference to the way you see those things.
So the strapline up there in the top left-hand corner was Christian perspectives on just about everything.
Yeah.
So this is what you're offering. So you can subscribe to that. Is that right? Is that people can get regular updates?
Yeah. If you go to the website, as I say, seenandunseen.com, you can have a look around it. And there's a link there you can click on and subscribe to the website, and then you can get regular downloads. We don't try to bombard people, but you get a couple of emails a week giving you highlights of what's on the site. So give you ideas of what's coming up. There's usually 1 or 2 new articles every day. We have three or four podcasts on the site as well. One main one called Re-Enchanting, which is hosted by Justin Brierley, some people know, and Bell Tyndall, one of our team, which interviews some really fascinating figures in public life, people with a faith, people without a faith, with the idea that, could a jaded and secular culture be re-enchanted with the Christian faith all over again? And so
let's have a closer look at that topic that we saw on the screen there about Israel, Gaza, Lebanon. 2 days ago was the anniversary of the Hamas attack there on October the 7th. And right outside our window in Amsterdam, we could see down to the left by the Dam Square, there was a big demonstration standing in solidarity with the Jewish people, the Israelis, the lost who were mourning their dead and those who are still held hostage. And a few hundred meters away, actually right in front of our building there, was this massive pro-Palestinian demonstration, and many, many police there. The mayor eventually had to disperse through water cannons and so forth. And it's an ongoing debate in Holland as to how this should have been handled. It's you write a current website about the different narratives that Christians read this event through, and you're asking the question, which narrative? Could you expand that a little?
Well, it seems to me that in the whole Middle Eastern situations surrounding the state of Israel, there are kind of 2 narratives that are very, in some ways, both internally quite coherent, and people believe one or the other. So one narrative would say that Israel is the only functioning democracy in the Middle East. It is a vital kind of bulwark in the fight against a deeply destructive Islamist ideology, which we've seen break out from time to time in Al-Qaeda, in ISIS, that has become embedded in Gaza and in Lebanon through Hamas and Hezbollah. And therefore, the West really has the responsibility to support Israel with whatever it does. And even though the response to the October 7th attacks was pretty brutal, the argument would be that this is war and civilians get hurt in war. And therefore, the responsibility of the West is to support Israel right the way down the line and make sure it wins its battle against Gaza, against Hamas, and against Hezbollah. And now you can see that narrative. And there's a kind of Christian narrative behind that, which is about the promises of God that he would bring the Jewish people back to their land, and that the foundation of the state of Israel in 1948 was the fulfillment of those prophecies. So that's one narrative. There's another narrative which says that right at the beginning of the founding of the state of Israel, those who founded the state committed an original sin, which was basically to kind of expel most of the Palestinians from the land. They basically stole land from the Palestinians. They continue to do it. Illegal settlements continue to kind of to steal land from the West Bank and so on, and the Israeli state turns a blind eye to it. They treat the Palestinians as second-class citizens. This is a people whose land has been taken from them, and they are oppressed, and therefore the West should really stand up for the Palestinians because they are oppressed people by this colonialist state. Now, both of those narratives are kind of coherent in their own way, and some people believe one, some people believe another. And you'll find Christians who believe one and Christians who believe another. And I guess my question is, what does Christian faith bring to that polarity? And the demonstrations you were talking about exactly exemplify that. We've had them in the UK as well. And I suppose I take the teaching of Jesus, the kind of remarkable, in some ways maybe quite ridiculous teaching of Jesus, that we are called to love our enemies. What does that mean in that context? Well, for those in the West, I think what it means is not that we have to suddenly change sides, and because we will have good reasons for the whichever side we take on it. But it is to make just that little bit of effort to see how things see from the other perspective. I mean, my own stories, I visited Israel and Palestine many, many times over the years. I started out going to Israel, staying on the East Jerusalem, listening to Palestinian Christians, really struck by how they felt really oppressed within their own country. And I came back very full of the strength of the Palestinian cause and would talk very much to anyone who would listen about it. I think over the years, I've also tried to listen to Jewish friends and Jewish voices and realized actually what it feels like to be a people who have been persecuted over many, many centuries, for whom Israel is a sudden place of haven and peace, and their desperate need for Israel to survive. And so to just begin to see the perspective from the other side of the one that you normally take. And I think only if we do that can we begin to make some kind of contribution to a longer term peace in the Middle East. And so I guess that's what I was trying to argue.
In your piece, you mentioned a book co-authored by a Palestinian and a Messianic Jew, Through My Enemy's Eyes. Is that or title?
Yeah.
Is that what are they trying to say?
Yeah, well, it's a Palestinian Christian called Salim Manaya and a Jewish Christian called Lisa Loden, who write together, both giving their perspective on their reading of the Bible, their reading of the current situation. And again, it seems to be what they're trying to do is to try to see the same issue through the eyes of the enemy. And traditionally, as a Palestinian and a Jewish person living in the land, they would be seen as enemies. But they have this common faith in Jesus Christ. And so that gives them the impetus, the desire, and if you like, the mandate to actually do this hard work of trying to see the same issue through the eyes of the enemy. And it's not that they come to an entire agreement. It's not that they agree on everything, but they're making this effort. And it seems to be that precisely is what kind of we need to do. So rather than saying, okay, my narrative is right, the other side is absolutely wrong, to try to make that evidence. Why do people see things differently from the other side? So if you are pro-Israeli, try to understand what it is like to be in a farming land in the West Bank, to find your land eaten away at you by settlers, to find your family attacked, people trying to get rid of you, trying to steal your land from you. If you're pro-Palestinian, try to understand what it is to be Jewish, to kind of feel that Israel is the only place in the world you can feel safe because of the kind of long history of anti-Semitism within the world, and so on. You know, I guess you get the point.
And of course, the Bible gives us a lot of prophetic insights, and there are those who emphasize the prophetic, i.e., foretelling what's going to happen, and they interpret that in a certain way. But then there are others who will point out there's the prophets who stand for justice, the prophets who stand for the oppression, against the oppression, and that leads you to approach things in a different way, and somehow to get the balance between these two.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the genre of prophecy within the Old Testament, I mean, it has a strong sense of some kind of prediction of the Jewish people being brought back to the land. Now, whether you think that is the state of Israel or whether there's something else, that's interesting. There's more of that in the Old Testament than there is in the New Testament. But there's a strand of some biblical prophecy that points towards some kind of return. Now, whether you interpret that politically in the state of Israel, whether it's something to do with the coming of Christ is another whole other question. But as you say, there's a strong, and pro-Israeli Christians will really sort of see those prophecies and see those as fulfillment. But there is that other strand of prophecy, which is saying that you must treat the outsider with justice. that especially within Israel, they were to treat the alien within their gates with a sense of fairness, that they were not to kind of oppress them. And therefore, there's an emphasis that Israel and the Jewish people have to kind of to treat those who are some of the minorities within their lands with justice. So you've got to balance out these two sort of prophetic strands of the Old Testament. Brings you to kind of understand, try to understand as much as you can the other perspective than the one you naturally take.
Graham, I'm going to take us in a different direction. My eye can catch a book behind you, Martin Luther. You've written a book about Martin Luther. You've written a number of books, and you're working on another book about Blaise Pascal. Now, I can understand you as a Protestant wanting to tell the story of Martin Luther. Blaise Pascal was Catholic. What's your interest in him? And why do you think he's relevant for us today, that you're taking the time to write a book about him?
Well, I think Pascal is a fascinating figure. I did some of my doctoral work on him many years ago, and he's fascinating because he partly because of the time when he was. You got his dates up there: born in 1623, died in 1662. Quite young, 39 when he died. Yeah. But he lives in the middle of the 17th century, which is the seminal century for the kind of hinge between the kind of medieval Reformation world and the modern world. So much happens.
Descartes and Baruch Spinoza, they were his contemporaries. Yeah,
exactly. You got Descartes. You got
yeah,
exactly. So, I mean, one reason why I think he's fascinating is because of the range of interests that he has. He's a mathematician. He's a physicist. He's a writer. He's a polemicist. He's a philosopher. He's a theologian. He basically invented probability theory, which is the basis of insurance and all kinds of things that we take for granted. He invented one of the earliest calculating machines, which is a precursor of the computer today. He basically invented the hydraulic press. He proved there was such a thing as a vacuum. He even invented buses. He and a few friends towards the end of his life invented the first proper urban transportation system in a European city in Paris. Yeah, horse-drawn carriages.
Horse-drawn, yeah.
Exactly, that's right. So he's an extraordinarily interesting person in terms of the range of his interests. He wrote probably the greatest work of satirical literature in French history, the Provincial Letters, which was a still very funny satire on the Jesuits of the time. So he's a fascinating character. The times he lives in is very interesting. He lives in the times of Louis XIII, Louis XIV. The rise of kind of French royal absolutism at a time when we had a civil war over in England. There was a kind of something similar going on in France, sort of social turmoil. So he's an interesting person in interesting times. I think the thing that particularly strikes me about him is that, and why he's particularly relevant for us today, is that we have our own culture wars, between the progressive and the conservative. And whether you're in the United States, whether in Europe or wherever it might be, you're aware of those culture wars. And he kind of lived in the middle of a similar kind of culture war, because at his time, the two figures that really dominated his mind, one was Michel de Montaigne. He was a sort of skeptical philosopher of the 16th century, so a little bit before Pascal's time, but very dominant in his time. And his whole kind of approach to life was, well, his great phrase was, "What do I know? Que sais-je? What do I know? I don't know anything." You can't know anything for sure. He's very sort of skeptical in his approach to life. So therefore, you just sort of just kind of lie back and just enjoy life as you can, and tend your cabbages and stroke your cat, which is kind of what he did. And then you got Descartes on the other side, who's a contemporary of Pascal. He's a little bit older. They never really got on very well. They met once, or they met twice within the same weekend. And Descartes is very different from Montaigne. He's very much more confident that we can understand the world by reason, and actually reason is the key to everything. And that actually, that us as human beings, we are thinking selves. The capacity of thought is our primary gift. So you've got this kind of tradition of skepticism on the one hand with Montaigne. We can't really know anything about the world, which kind of feels a bit like our kind of more postmodern strand of skepticism about great narratives and so on. But then you've got Descartes, who was very certain that he can know things about the world, and he's at the beginnings of modern science, and particularly about that very confident science that sort of seems to say that all you need to know is science. And so Pascal is obviously playing off these two against each other all the time. The skeptical tradition of Montaigne, the kind of dogmatist tradition of Descartes. And so he's right in the middle of a culture war in the same way as we are. And I think he's had some really interesting ways of dealing with it.
And tell us about his spiritual side, though.
Yeah.
He talked about the night of fire. What was that?
Well, he was kind of born into a sort of regularly Catholic family, sort of grew up fairly sort of normal, not particularly devout. He had his family were influenced by the Jansenist movement when he was in his sort of 20s, which was a kind of devotionally focused movement for a deeper spiritual life. And he was
kind of a charismatic movement of that day.
Yeah, maybe probably a bit more like the Puritans, I suppose. Okay. Into a kind of very intense, focused devotional life, a life of prayer,
strong
life of devotion,
personal relationship with Jesus.
Exactly, that's right. Yeah, and then he, and he was sort of influenced by this group for quite some time. Was kind of hanging around the edges of it, but he was also drawn to his scientific work and his mathematical explorations, and that's why this Jansenist sometimes viewed him with a bit of suspicion, because was he too much in love with the world because of all this other stuff he was involved with. And in November 1654, he has this very profound experience, and he dates it very to a particular day, a particular time in the evening, where for 2 hours he seems to have had this profound encounter with God, and he never told anybody about it. And he wrote this account of it on a poem, and it's at the top of the poem it has the word fire, and then it sort of describes this encounter with the God of Jesus Christ. And he never told anyone about it. He wrote it down. He folded up this piece of paper and folded it into his jacket and sewed up the jacket. Every time he changed his jacket, he would take it out and put it in again. And people only found it after he died. So when he died, age 39, quite young, a servant was cutting open his sort of jacket and felt something a bit odd under the surface, and they took it out, and there was this poem. And it seems that gave him a really renewed spiritual sort of devotion, that actually the most important thing in life was God. The most beautiful, the one thing that was worth sort of seeking after was God, and everything else had to take place, or had to kind of find its place around the search for God, as it were. And so he begins to kind of work out a way between these two impetuses of skepticism and dogmatism. And he conceives this idea of trying to write a kind of apology for Christianity, addressed at his friends who were not believers, who were skeptics, who were maybe, might be nominally Catholic, but not taking their religion very seriously at all. And so he starts writing down little thoughts. And eventually, he never finishes this work, but his friends and his family gather up the scraps of paper that he left behind him, and they eventually published it as the Pensées. The thoughts of Monsieur Pascal on religion and various other subjects was the topic, was the title. And this became the Pensées, which is still one of the kind of most celebrated, most widely read bits of Christian literature from the 17th century still today. And it still today carries a kind of remarkable power. Even though it's lots of fragments, it's not a kind of coherent argument all the way through. I still come across people today who find it incredibly thought-provoking, spiritually energizing, and people who found Christian faith precisely through reading the Pensées even today.
So, Graham, what do you want your readers to take away from your book? Other people have written books about Pascal, but there's obviously something in your quest to tell a better story that you want your readers to learn from Pascal. What's that?
Well, I think it is to show how Pascal found a way through the culture wars of his day, and how Christian faith enabled him to do that. And the way he did that was by saying, there are people who think that we can't know anything about the world, everything is uncertain, everything is just vague. You can't really be sure about very much at all. There are people who are very, very sure that they know what is real about the world, and science is a method to show that. And he kind of says, well, that's kind of part of our human condition. Part of our condition is that we basically have these moments when we're sure about everything and moments when we're unsure about everything. And that is explained by the fact that Christians say that we are both created and fallen, that we are created by God with this incredible capacity for knowledge, for understanding, for growth, but also we are fallen beings. We are people who have turned away from God. And as a result, we have these experiences of profound depression at times, or distraction where we just don't know anything for sure. And therefore, this device, this kind of understanding that we are created and fallen, helps to understand the human condition, which is caught between sort of certainty and uncertainty, between kind of hope and despair, between greatness and misery. And he often used to talk about how he wanted to make Christian faith attractive for people. He said, make it attractive, make good people wish it was true, and then show that it is. And I think he makes an extraordinary attempt to try to show how Christian faith actually is attractive even in cultures like ours. He talks about how, if we're honest about human life, we need saving. We're not just okay as we are. He often talks about how Christian faith offers a religion based on love, which is very different from the other faiths, and he compares it with others as well. He talks about how the revelation of Christ, this which is kind of mysterious. It's a kind of hidden revelation under the flesh of Jesus Christ. You could meet Jesus and you wouldn't know you were meeting you were shaking hands with God, and that kind of fits the ambiguous nature of the world in which we live. And also, it's a kind of religion that promises happiness, a way to happiness, both in this world and the next. And so I kind of hope that people will go away from this book, you're really interested in the story of Pascal, because I think it's an interesting story anyway, but actually discovering that in the Christian faith that he presented was something with extraordinary spiritual depth, and intellectual capacity, and culture-shaping power.
Now, you mentioned him as a father of probability theory, and as he applies that to the story of salvation, he comes up with Pascal's wager. What is that?
Well, the wager is an argument that's often misunderstood, I think. It's actually an argument where most people think the wager basically means that, you have to, you might as well bet on God existing, because if you bet on God existing and you're right, you promise you get a kind of whole eternity of bliss. Whereas if you bet on God not existing and you're wrong, then you potentially face a kind of eternity of pain. And now some people have some people are convinced by that argument, some people aren't. Actually, what I think the argument is doing is something a little bit different. He was interested in betting. He knew a lot of friends who gambled all the time. And I think what he's saying is that, and in fact, at one point, he has a correspondence with the great mathematician Fermat, Pierre de Fermat, on how do you predict a game that gets interrupted halfway through. So if you've got a gambling game and you're tossing coins and you can't finish, how do you allocate the stake when the game is finished halfway through? And he says that's a little bit like life, because actually the question of whether God exists or whether he doesn't exist, you don't know. There's no evidence, there's no strong evidence one way or the other. There's some indications that say that God does exist, some that says he doesn't. So how do you decide? And he says, well, a bit like gambling, you got to work out the odds. And so he says, well, the odds are like this. Well, if you were being a gambler on this, you would think, well, the odds for belief are basically saying, well, there's a bit of discomfort in this life. There's a bit of self-sacrifice to be involved, discipline within the Christian life, but you stand to gain an enormous great prize, which is eternal happiness in the presence of God. The case for unbelief is to say, well, you can kind of enjoy yourself for a few years in this life, but the big risk is that after this life is over, you either descend into nothingness or descend into eternal pain. So in other words, his point is, if you're a gambling person, it's obvious you'd always bet on belief, because you're giving a very small stake for a potentially large prize. It's the reason why everybody goes into the lottery, not because you think you're going to win necessarily, but for a pound or a dollar or a euro, you possibly stand to win an enormous great prize, and you do that. So his point is that if you're a gambling person, you'd always bet on belief. And then in the wager, the person he's talking to comes back and say, well, yeah, but I'm not really sure about this. And Pascal says, well, the point of this argument is to show that if you don't believe, the reason you don't believe is not because of reason, it's because of your passions. It's because you don't want to believe. Because the betting person, the kind of reasonable, logical case would always mean you bet on belief, because that's the best bet. So that's really what the wager is about. It's trying to uncover the real reasons why people don't believe, which he says is actually because we don't want to, not because our reason compels us not to believe.
Yeah. Now you talked about science and you talked about Descartes. The word science is really the word for knowledge, but it's only a certain type of knowledge. And it seems like Pascal was challenging Descartes to realize there actually, one of his famous quotes is that the heart has reasons that reason doesn't know. Could you comment on that we are captive ourselves to this narrow definition of science based on observable facts, but it actually leaves out a huge area of things we do know, but we haven't worked them out rationally?
Yeah, so when Pascal says the heart has its reasons, of which reason knows nothing, what he means by the heart is not so much, it's not kind of, romantic feelings, it's not emotion, it's not so much that. It's more there are certain things we just know by instinct. That we don't have reasons for, but we just know them. So he uses the example of the mathematical concept of infinity. No one knows what infinity is. We don't even know whether it's an even number or an odd number, but we kind of believe in it. And there are lots of things like that we kind of believe in without any kind of hard and fast reasons for it. And he thinks God is in that category. He thinks actually you cannot prove God, you can't disprove God. And so he says that there are certain things that science is really useful for, and mathematics are really useful for, and geometry is really useful for. But when it comes to questions of God, science doesn't really get you very far at all. And therefore, to try to kind of understand whether God exists through science is a bit of a fruitless task. It's the wrong tool for understanding it. The only way you can understand whether God exists actually is by actually living as if it's true. And that's the kind of conclusion of the wager. He kind of says, well, if you're stuck between belief and unbelief, what do? Well, you just try to live as if it's true for a while, and then you'll find that it is. And so that's, I think, what he means by it. He's actually, he does actually argue against those people like Descartes who thinks that sort of science and reason can understand everything. He says they are great, powerful things. He's a great scientist himself. He's right at the heart of the kind of modern scientific enterprise. But he says there are certain limits to what science can do. It does not really help us when it comes to understanding God, the origin of all things, and those sort of questions. That's where we need a whole other approach.
So let's come back to the 21st century then. This current cultural moment, how do you read that? I think I read somewhere on the website that somebody's making reference to the fact messy but hopeful. How do you see that, and how do you view the future?
Yeah, I think we're in a very interesting time. And back in 1989, I think it was Francis Fukuyama did that famous essay, "The End of History," where he argued that the future was going to be secular. It was the free market. It was Western. It was liberal. And actually, we look back on that now, and it's all of those things have been challenged. The attack on the Twin Towers, the rise of Islam, the huge growth of Christianity around the world has reminded us that the future is not necessarily secular. The free market was the future. We had the financial crash in 2008 that made us realize that the free market is not maybe the answer to everything. The future is Western. Well, the rise of China now makes us realize that the West is no longer necessarily the way that the future is going to go. And again, the future was sort of liberal free market democracy with the rise of Putin, of Brexit, of Donald Trump, Bolsonaro. The rise of populism has led a great sort of challenge to kind of the liberal world order, if you like. And so in some ways, I think what we have now is a situation where all those things have been questioned. So, the great post-war ideologies of sort of fascism, of communism, even of atheism. Fascism fell at the end of the Second World War. Communism fell in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. The new atheism project has kind of run into the sand. I mean, there are a lot of atheists around, but Dawkins and friends, no one really listens to them much anymore. So there's a kind of lack of big ideas. And what strikes me at the moment, you think of our recent election in the UK, Keir Starmer was elected not because of any great vision he had. It's kind of hard to say exactly what his vision was. It was more that we were fed up with the last lot and we wanted a new lot put in. Same with America and Kamala Harris, Donald Trump. Is there any great vision behind either of those? And so we're stuck in this sort of personality politics, this politics of fear, this sense of a kind of messy world where there's really no big ideas out there. And so the question is, we're in a kind of cultural vacuum, I think, at the moment. And therefore, it's a moment in which, Christian faith, as something that has had in the past great power to sort of shape cultures, has a bit of an opportunity. And there are signs of one or two people who are kind of being drawn to Christian faith in public life. And so that's something of how I kind of read that. I mean, I think the darker side is that there may be some darker forces that might fill that gap and vacuum at the same time. There's sort of evidence, we've written a bit on the website, of a kind of renewed interest in paganism as the kind of past of Europe coming back to haunt us. And some people are kind of interested in that. But actually, that's a kind of dark vision because it's a very sort of polarized and an oppositional vision, rather than the Christian vision of a society which embraces within it diversity, but within the one harmony of an ordered world, which is given to us by Christian faith. So that's something of how I read the current moment.
Thank you, Graham. I want to thank you both for taking the time to chat with us today. And thank you for the initiatives you've taken, setting up the Center for Cultural Witness, and giving us tools to help us all tell a better story. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Jeff.